I hate war, but I am a student of war. Let me explain. Welcome back to Bold Books and Bones. In this episode, I'd like to share with you another ancient book about the Chinese thinking on war and conflict. Now, war and conflict are, as we all know, terrible things. They are, unfortunately, also part of life, because they are part of our human nature. Now, as a psychologist, I try to understand these phenomena, because as long as human nature will not change, war and conflict will, unfortunately, continue. In this episode, I want to share with you some psychological patterns that are applied in conflict, but also in competitions of all sorts. And these principles are well described in an old Chinese book called the 36 Stratagems. Before I dive into the book and share what it contains, I want to give you a bit of context on how to read this book. And I want to explain why I share this with you. I see 5 areas where the insights of this book are frequently applied. It is of course applied in warfare, but also a lot in politics. And you find its application in sports competition. It is applied a lot in business, and it can be applied in our personal lives to keep us safe. Let's zoom in for a moment on how it can be applied in our personal lives. If you feel that you are in a toxic relationship, or you see that you are in a toxic environment at work, or if you look at the news and see what is going wrong in the world these days, then we all might feel confused or even lost at times. And when we feel confused and lost, then we are at our weakest. And that is where your opponent wants you to be. Because then we have no control over the situation that we are in. And the only thing we do is getting more absorbed by the toxicity of the situation. Ultimately, we lose all our freedom. And freedom is, I think, something very precious that we should safeguard at all times. One step to gain control again in such situations is by learning to read or to decode the setting that makes you uncomfortable. And yes, there is an alphabet for it. The Chinese book called the 36 Stratagems describes the patterns that are used in situations where people get deceived. If you're able to recognize the patterns, then you might be able to respond to it and to protect yourself or others. Let me show you how it works. Look at this. What is it? It is of course the letter A. And if I would show you a variation of this character, then you would still each time say, this is the letter A. We recognize this pattern of lines since many of us had to study it as the first character of the Latin or Roman alphabet. So the lines form a pattern, and we call this pattern a character. And everything that looks like it, we identify as the same character. Bear with me, because the same applies to human interactions and to human interactions during conflict. There are patterns that describe the dynamics between people in such moments. And when there is conflict, war or competition, we call these patterns stratagems. Let's focus now a bit more on the concept of stratagems. You might also remember from part 1 of this episode, called The Art of War, that stratagems are actions that are based upon deception. And that is what makes them so confusing, often almost invisible or even toxic. The book The 36 Stratagems is one of the oldest existing books that talks about deceptions. And as the title reveals it already, it describes 36 patterns of deception. I think it is fair to say that this book contains the basic alphabet of deception. The letters of the alphabet are easy to recognize because we have been using them daily all of our lives. Stratagems have been around since forever. But for most of us, no one really taught us what to look for and how to recognize them. If you don't recognize them when they are applied to you in your personal life, then you might end up in a trap without even knowing how you got there. So if you can analyze a toxic setting or a battle or a sports competition, you can observe them from the perspective of stratagems. For example, in many cases I see that when Western people describe a specific battle, they start with describing the armies and the weapons and firepower that was available to the parties involved. They might observe that Army A had 1,000 tanks and other heavy artillery, and that they had 100,000 troopers. And then they describe how the opponent, how Army B looked like. However, what is striking when I hear Chinese people talking about the same battle, the way of looking at it is in most cases completely different. And you can see this in this book, The 36 Stratagems, and also in the book The Art of War by Sun Tzu. They almost never mention the features of an army. Instead, their focus is on the specific patterns of interaction between armies. So let's dive into the book The 36 Stratagems and what it has to say. The book was mentioned for the first time in the official history of the Southern Qi dynasty, which existed in China about 1,500 years ago. That is why we know that this book or these concepts had been around for a very long time. About 300 years ago, probably at the time of the Ming dynasty, an unknown scholar compiled the 36 stratagems into a small book called The Secret Art of War, The 36 Stratagems. It was first published in 1941 in a printing house in Chengdu in China. And since then it started to spread all over the world and got translated in many languages. The book is divided in 6 parts, with each 6 stratagems. The first part describes stratagems when you are in a superior position. So if you judge that you have the advantage over your opponent. The second part is about stratagems for confrontation. The next one are stratagems for attack, and so on. And the last one is about stratagems for desperate situations. Now each stratagem has a name and a number. For example, there is stratagem number 15 that is also called Lure the Tiger Out of the Mountains. Or there is stratagem number 20, also called Fish in Troubled Waters. You saw another example of a stratagem in part 1 of this episode, where Mr. Kong applies it to protect his village. The example that I illustrate there is an application of the stratagem called Kill with a Borrowed Knife, and is described as stratagem number 3 in this book. Each of these stratagems represent a pattern of deception and is meant to describe how people interact with each other as a result of it. Let's have a look at stratagem number 15, called Lure the Tiger Out of the Mountains. It belongs to the stratagems for attack. The tiger refers to a strong enemy or opponent. Now, if a tiger lives in the mountains, then that is his territory. The tiger knows where to go, where to hide, and which places are best to attack. So this reminds us that if we want to defeat the tiger, then going into the mountains and fight on his territory might not be the best move, since there he would be in his strength. Now, if we want to defeat a tiger or strong opponent, step 1 is to get him out of the mountains, to lure him out. I heard once the story that a long time ago in China, farmers would lure an actual tiger that attacked their livestock by tying a sheep to a pole in open territory. The tiger would see or smell it and would leave the mountains to get to the apparent easy prey. So in this stratagem, you have to think about a kind of bait. What would be so attractive to an opponent that he or she would leave his or her territory? Keep in mind that usually everyone has a weak spot, is afraid of something or has a boss. So you normally start to look in these three domains to find a potential bait. Once he is in open territory near the sheep, the farmers would surround the tiger with long spears and would stab the animal to death. The tiger, while no longer in the territory, lost all his advantages. So the pattern is straightforward. You do not fight your enemy or opponent in his territory where he has all the advantages. Instead, you lure him into a place where the advantages don't work anymore. Let's apply this now to sports competition, because there is where I often see it applied. There is this infamous fight in 1976 between the great Muhammad Ali and Antonio Inoki from Japan. Inoki was not a boxer, but he had a martial arts background in professional wrestling. Both were strong opponents with profoundly different fighting styles. So we have two tigers living in distinctly different mountains. If the wrestler would try to box, he would most probably lose from Ali. If Muhammad Ali would fight the wrestler on the ground, then most probably Ali would not stand a chance either. So what happens during the fight? What we see on this picture is telling the story of most of the fight. Inoki laying on the ground and does everything to lure Ali to the ground. And Ali does not get lured into it and does everything to try to fight Inoki while standing up. And Inoki does everything to avoid this. The fight ended in a draw. And many people who watched the fight were disappointed, because there had not been enough action during the fight. Even today, there are debates about this fight. One of the few people who was positive about the fight was the referee at the time. His name is Jean Lebel, a respected martial art expert. He said about this fight, it was a thinking fight. It was two champions in their arts. I think he was right, because both were experienced martial arts practitioners and they knew that they had to stay put and only engage with the other when on their own territory. Fighting on the other person's territory would lead them to defeat. So both of them applied stratagem number 15 perfectly. Maybe that is why they respected each other so much after the fight and even became good friends. I will leave a few links about this fight in the comment section in case you would like to judge for yourself what really happened. So if you want to avoid getting trapped in stratagem number 15, then look at what your strengths are and think of where you can deploy them the best. So think, which mountains do you need to be successful? Next, make sure that you don't get lured out of your mountains by a provocation or by false promises. In this way, you will stay safe. There are many translations of this book, and I would recommend this one if you know Chinese and you want to start from the source text. However, if you are like me and need more information and more guidance, then I would recommend this book, written by Hiroshi Moriya, a Japanese expert on Chinese culture, and it was translated into English by William Scott Wilson, who is specialized in translating old books about martial arts. I hope that this was useful, but please keep one thing in mind. The classical Chinese way of thinking about war is different from the one that most of us are used to. It is not about direct confrontation, violence and destruction, but it comes from a philosophy to protect and to stop violence. There was also no place for idolizing war and warfare. And therefore, if you look at the Chinese character for martial arts, or the art of fighting, then this character is called Wu, and it is composed of two parts. The first part contains the character Ge, which means weapon or violence. And the second part of the character is called Zhi, which means to stop. So martial arts in the traditional Chinese thinking had the purpose to stop the violence. If you like this episode, please subscribe and press that notification bell, then you won't miss other episodes like this one. And maybe you want to check out other videos on the Bold Books and Bones YouTube channel where I talk about other amazing books. Hope to see you soon at Bold Books and Bones. Bye.